Well, it's almost spring, outside at least. Welcome to the Rubin Museum of Art. I'm Tim McHenry, I'm the producer here. And this, yes, is a museum of Himalayan art. And we like to make connections where they might not always be obvious. So, hands up, who smelled something exquisite this morning, today? Yes, you smelled something fresh? Yes, okay, good. So there's some conscious bodies here in this room. I'm happy to see that. Well, we're doing our own scratch and sniff experiment next Saturday on March the 13th with Christophe Ladamiel, the perfumier, and Stuart Firestein, the neurobiologist. And what we're going to do is understand what happens in our brains when we smell certain things, and we're going to be given little potions and dips and smelling sticks and things like that. And as you smell each element, Firestein will take us through what's going on in our brains when we are stimulated in one particular way. And it so happens, as you know, being a museum dedicated to a lot of Buddhist art, we're full of compassion. So we're going to give a couple of tickets away to that program. But of course, compassion doesn't work unless wisdom is allied to it. So the wisdom really has to come from you. And the wisdom or knowledge that we need is your name and some contact details, so we can alert you to the fact that you have won a pair of tickets to next Saturday's program, when it will be really, really bad weather and you'll want to be here. You might have noticed that there's that very elegant Brainwave brochure on your seat, or was, and a very discreet visitor information card, which invites you to enter said details of name and contact details. And we'll collect those cards at the end of the Q&A session, and then we'll pull the winning one out of a Himalayan hat, maybe, and alert you tomorrow by email whether you've won the tickets for next Saturday's program. It's going to be very, very stimulating. Stuart Firestein has been here once before as part of Brainwave with the Indian chef Raghavan Iyer, and we did the same thing. We tasted spices that were ingredients of Iyer's recipes, and work out what was actually happening within us as we were tasting. So it's going to be a crackerjack program. Well, talk about crackerjack programs. I've got one for you this afternoon. And Stephen Batchelor, in this book, has placed Buddha Shakyamuni in the socio-political environment of his time, and has really recontextualized our understanding of what the Buddha was trying to tell us. And it's a stunning, pithy, cogent, elegant, eloquent read, and I suggest you all buy a copy at the end of this program. You'll want to after hearing Stephen and Owen talk about it. I can't recommend it highly enough. I had a wonderful time reading it, so please. So what we try to do here and in Brainwave is, I mean, when you're seeking enlightenment, you need complete control of your mind. You have to know what your mind actually is. And so that's the purpose of Brainwave, putting neuroscientists together with people from other walks of life to find out how our brains actually function within the environment we find ourselves in, and that means our minds. And so I'm so glad that we're able to celebrate the publication of Stephen Batchelor's new book. And we've put him together with Professor Owen Flanagan, who's no stranger to this museum. He was here a couple of years ago with the photographer Kenro Izu, and they talked about happiness and what the nature of that is. That we celebrated Kenro Izu's exhibition of Bhutanese portraits, and gross national happiness, of course, is one of the policies of that, the last remaining Himalayan kingdom. And he and Kenro had a wonderful conversation. And in fact, Kenro Izu is going to come back here in May to celebrate the publication of his own book of photography. So I hope you look out for that. Now, Owen is the James B. Duke Professor of Neurobiology at Duke University, and He's no stranger to Buddhism because in 1999 he was invited to Dharamsala to take part in a conference with the Dalai Lama on the topic of destructive emotions, and indeed a book emerged on that, and it was called Beyond Destructive Emotions, a Scientific Collaboration with the Dalai Lama, which was narrated by Daniel Goleman. But Owen Flanagan has also written a book which came out in 2007 called The Really Hard Problem, Meaning in a Material World, which contextualizes the purpose of life within Buddhism in a wonderfully cogent way. And he's currently writing The Bodhisattva's Brain, which hopefully will come out next year, and maybe even we'll have the opportunity of celebrating that book here too. So I think this is a beautiful marriage of minds here as part of Brainwave with Stephen Batchelor, Owen Flanagan. Please give them a very warm welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Good. Good to be here. Stephen, let me just start. I've also had the opportunity to read your wonderful book, which I think of as part autobiography and part anthropology, historiography. The biography part, as I understand it, is a way of explaining, as Stephen has done in many of his previous books, how it was possible for this once upon a time young lad from England to find his way over to India and eventually Tibet and then Korea and Japan, becoming two different kinds of monks. First a Geluk monk in the Dalai Lama's lineage in India, and then eventually a Zen monk. And now, then along the way, finding some problem with what we in philosophy would call metaphysical issues in Buddhism, in particular karma and rebirth, and coming to the point where you now call yourself a Buddhist atheist. So I think it'd be interesting to ask you to talk a little bit about that journey and how we make sense of this idea of a Buddhist atheist, because some people, of course, will say, well, Buddhism is atheistic to begin with. So maybe tell us a little bit about your story, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much, Owen. I left England as basically a young hippie, very much informed by the counterculture of the 1960s. And I was 18 then. I had just finished grammar school, or high school as you would call it, and was thoroughly disillusioned with the whole Western system of education. I was no doubt alienated, romantic, and fascinated with the East. And this led me to travel overland, as was possible in those days, across what are currently war zones, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and finally arrived in India, went up to Dharamsala. This would have been in September '72, and immediately became involved in Buddhist studies at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. And Buddhism, I think, really gave me a context to give some sense and orientation to my otherwise very confused life. And I became a passionate practitioner of the Dharma. I was a very devout Buddhist. I had been brought up in a non-religious family, and I think I missed something of the religious experience because of that. And so when I got involved in Tibetan Buddhism, I went the whole hog with lots of rituals and very elaborate altar and great devotion to my teachers. And this was really one of the most meaningful things that I had ever come across. I eventually became a monk in, I think, 1974, and then I came back to Switzerland to be with my teacher, Geshe Rabten, who wanted to start a small training group in Buddhist dialectics and philosophy. And it was actually during that training when we were given these dialectical tools, and we were told not to accept Buddhist doctrine just on face value, but to subject it to rigorous analytical critique, that I began to have serious doubts about doctrines that for many Buddhists, maybe most Buddhists, are somehow really non-negotiable. The doctrines, as Owen mentioned, of rebirth, the continuity of consciousness after the death of the physical body, and the law of karma that somehow we inherit from infinite past lifetimes that determines how we are born, and also the acts we commit now will determine our future life after death. I found this kind of metaphysics very difficult to accept, and I found that even the arguments that were given to support them did not even fulfill the logical criteria of valid proof that I'd been taught to respect in my training in dialectics. This was a crisis for me because I was presenting myself publicly as a shaven-headed, red-robed representative of the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism, and yet in my heart of hearts, I realized that there were certain key beliefs that I couldn't really, in all good faith, accept. It was at that point, actually, that I resolved the problem by adopting an agnostic position. In other words, I was able to find a middle ground whereby I didn't have to deny rebirth and karma, but I was also not required either to affirm them. I think now that was perhaps a bit of a cop-out, but it was certainly gave me the breathing space to come to terms with some of these ideas. In practice, though, I then, after a year or two of this anxiety and uncertainty, I left the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I went to South Korea, where I became a monk in a Zen monastery, Songwangsa, and spent 4 years just training in asking myself the question, what is this? Cultivating what in Zen is called the great doubt. And since I had maybe not the great doubt, but lots and lots of other littler doubts, this was a practice that fitted me very neatly. And I loved the years I spent just sitting in a darkened room, facing a wall, and asking myself, what is this? After a number of years, my teacher died. I left the monastery. I married the woman who is now my wife, who was a nun in this same monastery. And we settled in a community in England, a lay Buddhist community. And from that point, I've really spent my time writing about Buddhism, teaching meditation. For whatever reason, I've found myself adopted by the Vipassana community, even though that's the one tradition in which I haven't trained. And that has really been what I've been doing ever since. And in recent years, particularly since about the year 2000, I've become particularly interested in trying to get to the source of the Buddhist tradition, both in terms of the ideas that appear to be distinctively and originally those of the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, in distinction to those ideas that were already current in his time. And having also then taken an interest in pilgrimage, I started more and more to be curious about who this man was and what sort of world he lived in. And that has led me to try to reconstruct the story of the Buddha's life in a much more detailed way than when we would normally be familiar, and a way that leaves aside the rather mythic account of his life and focuses on his involvement continuously in the social, political realities of his time.
So sitting in a dark, having great doubt in Korea, and you met Martine. That's an interesting story, isn't it? So let's switch over there then to so now you sometimes, and we'll get back to this, I'm sure, call yourself in the book a late 20th century Christian secular existentialist.
Post-Christian.
Post-Christian. Oh, that's right. I've discovered this recently in divinity schools in particular. The faculty who are lapsed anything, lapsed Catholic, lapsed Jew, call themselves post-Jewish, post-Catholic. This is the latest. So we'll come back to this question of whether or not there are any necessary membership criteria for being a Buddhist and continuing to call yourself a Buddhist, or whether or not the concept of a Buddhist atheist, as I said at the beginning, many people will say, well, Buddhism doesn't have a creator God, but as my friend Sam Harris, he would be someone that you would call an aggressive atheist. Sam loves Vipassana, but will say Buddhism is full of hocus pocus. And you all know about this. I heard people in the audience talking about wrathful deities. There are heaven and hell realms. There's all kinds of stuff. And Stephen, you do say early in the book that you realized when you did have your questions about rebirth that sent you to the agnostic position, that rebirth did seem to you, as it does to many Buddhists, to be an essential feature of Buddhism. So it's an interesting question, just as we might say about Christianity. What are the membership criteria for being a Christian? Do you have to believe that Jesus is the Son of God? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Are Unitarians Christians? I don't know. It's an interesting question. Mm-hmm. But let's switch then to, and we can come back to that. So in the book, you contrast an image of the Buddha as the one view is of him as a god or a godlike, omniscient being who lives essentially a perfect life once he reaches enlightenment and for the rest of his time on earth, and then goes on to nirvana. And you say again and again, you use words such as this. You say he's funny, he's ironic, he's very political, and he's a pragmatic, non-speculative, non-metaphysical thinker whose primary mission is therapeutic. And it's been a long time, I think, of Rahula's book where he talks about this therapeutic aspect of Buddhism, but it's been a long time since people have emphasized this, that this is really possibly among the world's great wisdom traditions, a really pragmatic and therapeutic way of living, which is why it's so exportable and importable across life forms. But talk about this. Maybe you can talk a little bit about whatever you want, but about his relationship with the king, Pasendi, the political intrigue, and that makes you want to tell the story of the Buddha in a way that, I guess, humanizes him.
Well, again, I'd spent probably the first 20, 25, 30 years of my time as a Buddhist referring endlessly to the Buddha, finding myself saying, the Buddha said this, the Buddha said that, and without really having any clear sense of who this person was. The Buddha was, I think, without question, an historical figure, and yet he's a very sort of vague and imprecise person. And the imagery, the iconography of Buddhism has depicted him more and more as you mentioned, as a kind of godlike figure. And his attributes have become increasingly perfect, such that he's considered to be omniscient, omni-compassionate. He does not even have a conceptual thought that runs in his mind, his pure spontaneity, and so forth and so on, which I think is a very inspiring ideal, and I certainly wouldn't want to somehow just sweep all that away. I do think we need such idealizations to operate as symbols of awakening or of what a human being can become. But we lose sight in the process of the Buddha as a living person in a concrete world. And the more that I began to think of Buddhism in terms of its concrete applications, in terms of its transformative power, not in some hypothetical future life when I become a Buddha myself, but actually how can I use these teachings and practices to affect the quality of my life here and now. And this becomes for me more and more what the teaching has to be about. If it doesn't make a difference to my life now, then really what value does it have? And I was taught in the Tibetan tradition that if you have concern for this life, you're not really a Buddhist. That a Buddhist is someone who has a multi-life perspective, who is more concerned with this grand, rather beautiful vision of endless, potentially endless lifetimes, working in Mahayana Buddhism for the welfare of all beings. That's very beautiful. But it somehow is distant from the challenge I face from day to day of responding to my friends, to my wife, to my family, to my students, of getting by in the world that is here and now. What I liked about the Zen training is that it brought one's awareness right back into the actual edge of life as we lead it now. And Buddhism is for me something that has no real meaning unless it actually contributes in a transformative way to how I am now. By exploring and trying to reconstruct the person of the Buddha, I found that this was a parallel inquiry that came together very much with this emphasis on the pragmatism of his teachings. And I found that rather than diminish him, and some people have said, but if you think of him as always involved with these kings and struggling to deal with the ambitions of his family, isn't this actually reducing him to someone really just rather like us, and somehow losing, therefore, the inspirational power that the image of him is, for so many people, crucially important? But I found the opposite. I found that in humanizing the Buddha, in bringing the Buddha, in a sense, back to earth, I found that my respect for him as a figure, as an historical figure, has only grown. And in a secular world such as our own, in a world where I think many of us have perhaps gone beyond the need to hold metaphysical or religious certainties about afterlives or heaven or hell, I think we're at a position where we really do need to radically rethink our relationship to the sources of our own traditions. A similar movement, of course, is happening in Christianity with movements such as the Jesus Seminar, where, again, it's the historicity of Jesus that somehow makes not only his person, but also what he says, have a far greater import for the actual day-to-day life that we lead as human beings.
What would you say, Stephen, if you were asked what I'm about to ask you? So the Buddha was a political, pragmatic, non-speculative, therapeutic thinker. What was what is the greatest piece of wisdom that this pragmatic, therapeutic person gave us that perhaps is the same as we get in other great spiritual and wisdom traditions, or is different? What would you?
Well, I think it's different. I'm not a universalist. I'm not interested in somehow demonstrating how the Buddha was actually saying the same thing as Jesus or Muhammad or Confucius or Lao Tzu. That I don't find so very helpful. In fact, although there are obviously broad common values that these great figures would have agreed on, what I feel is more important is to see what it is that distinguishes one from the other. I find that the attempt to level everything out, even the idea of enlightenment, to think, well, Rumi was enlightened, the Buddha was enlightened, Jesus was enlightened. I don't think that's very helpful. It may lead to a greater tolerance. That, of course, is a good thing. But at the cost of actually diminishing what is defining and distinctive in such a figure. You can boil the Buddha's teachings down to, let's say, what is most distinctive in the Buddha's teachings for me can be boiled down to 4 little words. It is embrace, let go, stop, act, which conveniently is the acronym ELSA. Now, this is the most boiled down version I've arrived at for what are traditionally called the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are, for me, the very, very heart of what the Buddha taught. At the conclusion of the Buddha's first sermon, a translation of which is found in the appendix to the book, the Buddha says, "It was not until my knowledge and vision was entirely clear about the Four Noble Truths that I could consider myself to have attained a peerless awakening in this world." So it's utterly clear what the Buddha considered to be that to which he had woken up under the Bodhi tree. It wasn't some grand nature of reality, some profound insight into the true substance of mind, or anything of that order, but rather what the Buddha woke up to was a process. He woke up to the fact that we can live in this world in a radically different way from an entirely new perspective. But that perspective is not arrived at by some shattering enlightenment where suddenly all is revealed, but rather it begins with embrace. In this case, embrace suffering. One's own suffering, the suffering of others, the suffering of the world. The first noble truth, the truth of suffering, is not a truth claim that there is suffering. We all know that. It's an injunction. It's an invitation to act in a certain way. It's a task. And the Buddha calls that dukkha pariññā. Fully know dukkha. Fully know dukkha. That's where it begins. And that, I think, is the starting point of the whole Buddhist practice. And again, it might sound even a little bit unappealing. It's certainly counterintuitive. The Buddha seems to be saying, well, if you really want to live a full and rich and happy life, then fully know suffering. And it's that fully knowing of suffering that leads to the second noble truth, which is the letting go of craving. In other words, once we begin to tap into that sensibility of the poignant, tragic nature of our lives, that our priorities begin to adjust. And instead of thinking of our life as an environment for getting what we want and getting rid of what we don't like and trying to manipulate the world according to our desires and fears, we let go of that, or that begins to fall away quite naturally in such a way that it leads us to the third truth, which is that of the stopping of grasping, the cessation of clinging. And those moments at which we suddenly find that we're not beholden, it's not determined that we will behave in a selfish, greedy way, that we discover an opening in our lives to create a path, a way of life, the Eightfold Path or the Fourth Noble Truth, that opens up a practice that is not just about becoming a spiritual practice. It's not about becoming proficient in meditation. That's only a part of it. It has to do with reorienting our whole life according to a different vision of what a human being can ultimately become.
What about the role of, well, in the West? It seems as if many people who I talk to who will consider themselves Buddhists or post-Christian Buddhists, I guess, or post-Jewish Buddhists, will talk among themselves about their practice, and their practice they invariably mean their meditation practice. And often such people know nothing or little, next to nothing about, as Tim said at the beginning, the wisdom part of Buddhism, or even the ethics of Buddhism, the sila or karuna part. And we know, though, that this is a kind of the wonderfully assimilative and accommodative character of Buddhism is such that it really is, and partly this, by the way, is because of its non-theism, I think, that it's so able to adapt to local conditions. But we know that the meditation focus is not that common. For example, George Dreyfus's wonderful book, The Sound of Two Hands Clapping, which is about all the noise. When you ask George, who was, I think...
Yes, I know George.
You know George, and he was a Tibetan monk for, I think, longer than anyone else. And The Sound of Two Hands Clapping is about what it's like to live in a Tibetan monastery, and all he says is it's very noisy. People are yelling all the time. They're reciting all the time. They're memorizing all the time. There's noise in the kitchen. There's noise on the soccer field. And there's debating, and there's clapping. Touché. So when one is in Thailand, where I was for a month this summer, and one asks people about their practice, very few people I met meditate. But if I ask any university person, do you believe in rebirth? They say, of course. That's why I give money to monks. It's merit. So it's the same old thing everywhere. There's some cash cow or other trying to collect a little money for religion. It's interesting because there is this idea, which at some points you do say, like on page 53, you're talking about the influence of people like Sartre and Heidegger and Levinas in particular, and you say that you realized that belief in rebirth was a denial of death. Actually, that's interesting in terms of what you were just saying about the focusing on this life. I mean, it's a paradoxical claim that Buddhism itself is prone to making mistakes such that it will get us focused on the wrong thing. But I guess the question that I'd be interested in you answering for us, a Western audience, is what do you, maybe this takes you away from the book a little bit, but you spent these 6 months of a year in the Great Doubt in Korea. What do you think of as the role of meditation in the basic Buddha's insights as you just described them? What is the role? Is it important? Is it essential?
I think meditation, I'm quite convinced that meditation is utterly central to the Buddhist way of life. And by that I mean the ability that we have as human beings to train ourselves in such a way that we can become more single-pointed, we can become more concentrated, and that brings with it a certain calm. It also brings with it a certain kind of inner depth. And on the basis of that, enables us to examine and to consider and to be aware of what's going on from a vantage point which may not be that of our ordinary, muddled, busy, everyday consciousness. The problem is that meditation, perhaps because it is so unfamiliar in our culture, we don't really live in a world, we're not brought up in the modern West, valorizing meditation practice. And I think for many of us, we're drawn to Buddhism because this is the element that seems to be the most practical, that for which we perhaps are most in need of. It's the element that seems to offer the most immediate effects. And the danger, therefore, is that we begin to reductively identify Buddhist practice with proficiency in certain spiritual disciplines and techniques, and we lose touch with the fact that these practices only have meaning within the context of a way of life. And again, the Eightfold Path is not just about meditation at all. It's about how we see the world. It's about how we think, how we motivate ourselves morally, ethically, how we communicate, how we act, how we work. All of these things are integral to what is called practice. Many Westerners I found today, when you ask them what their practice is, the knee-jerk response will be to name a particular spiritual exercise. That's really quite alien to the way the Buddha presented the path. For him, the practice, or bhavana, is just as much concerned with how we communicate, how we work, how we think. All of these can become practices. Meditation, of course, is an integral part of that. And one could perhaps think of meditation as being, in fact, like the hub of the wheel, and the wheel as a whole, including thinking, speaking, etc. The trouble is that by privileging meditation, it's as though we take the hub out and disconnect it, or we're in danger of doing this, from the rest of our lives. And a hub of a wheel, however beautifully designed it is, if it's not tied to the spokes and the rim, is useless. And so I feel that although meditation, Buddhist meditation, has been enormously important in many people's lives, it's often their point of entry into Buddhist thought, it risks being still somehow cut off from or distanced from the far greater and more difficult practice of living a true, authentic, wise, compassionate life in the context of this world with others, and in a sense from the totality of our own being.
As you know, Stephen, my own involvement, since this is called Brainwave, my own involvement with an interest in Buddhism started, I guess I always had the interest, but it actively started when I was invited by the Dalai Lama to this particular discussion of a small group of scientists, and I was the token philosopher, or neurophilosopher as we call ourselves now, to talk about the topic of destructive emotions. And that was an incredibly wonderful experience. My job on the first morning we were there was to teach His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, about what Plato and Aristotle and Hume and Hobbes thought about our emotions. And I did tell him, I think, in fact, I know I told him this, I said, no one in the West has ever said that humans are innately good. And that led to a very profitable discussion. I said, we either say we're 50% selfish and 50% fellow-feeling, but no one ever says we're all good. And he said, well, I didn't really mean it that we're all good. We have potential to be good. But it was after those meetings that, well, earlier, the year before I went there, the Dalai Lama had published a book which was very popular called The Art of Happiness, which some people will know, that he wrote with Howard Cutler, a psychiatrist, I'm sorry, not an analyst, from Arizona. And within about a year or two of our meetings, I had been over there with some neuroscientists, and they hatched the idea that they should start studying Buddhist meditators on brain imaging machines. And indeed they did, and in about 2002, I was asked to comment on some of this research, and I wrote a very short article that was titled The Color of Happiness that was published in the New Scientist magazine. And that was my 15 Warhol minutes that occurred the next day. And it said, Buddhists discover happiness center in brain, or something to that effect. And what I now call the neurojournalists. Everything has to have neuro in front of it nowadays. So there's generally this neuroenthusiasm or the neuroenthusiasta. But everybody was out of the gate. And somehow or other, it was that I had discovered it. All I had done was comment on a study on one monk, Matthieu Ricard, who has now come out, who's the Dalai Lama's French interpreter and a wonderful man who would walk around Dharamsala smiling. And my son, I said, look at how happy he is. My son said, he's not married and doesn't have teenage children. Nonetheless, Matthew's brain lit up in the happiness department, left prefrontal cortex. This is associated with not being depressed, let's put it that way. And Matthew was meditating at the time. And anyway, it's been impossible for the last 7 years, I would say, because of where I'm located, to stop people from saying to me at dinner parties or telling me that it has been discovered that Buddhists are the happiest people in the world. It sounds like a Barbra Streisand song. But it's very peculiar because there is no such evidence. And if there were such evidence, it would not, there's nothing, I mean, as you say, I think this is very helpful because there's a sales pitch that occurs in the West, and that it is, you mention it because, of course, among the bodhisattvas' vows or the virtues that come from admitting are compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, happiness for other people, and zero-sum games, and a kind of equanimity, which we immediately hear as it's about me. But as I understand upekkha or upekkha, whether it's in Pali or Sanskrit, this is equanimity in community with other people. It's not just a personal state of mind. But what are your thoughts about that, Stephen, about since you are now a secular, Western, now officially atheistic Buddhist, what do you think about, I mean, you must have lots of people that come with you and Martine on tours or come to do meditation with you who have bought into this pitch about it will produce, Buddhism or Buddhist meditation will produce these positive states of mind.
Well, I think it is true. I mean, to some extent, one practices meditation because one has certain crises in one's lives. One may suffer from depression or a sense of lack of meaning, and Buddhism sometimes helps heal those particular troubled areas in one's life. And so, relatively speaking, yes, one becomes a happier person. But I find it rather odd that such emphasis is placed on this word happiness, as though that's the be-all and end-all of Buddhism. And perhaps more to the point, it's never been something that I have really consciously pursued in my practice of Buddhism. At a certain abstract level, if I step back, then I suppose I would have to say, yes, like any person, I'm seeking well-being or eudaimonia or something like that. But that's never been the motive. Buddhism for me has always been far more about how can I arrive at some clearer understanding of what it means to be human. How can I live a way of life in which I reach a closer and more intimate sense of being alive in this extraordinary, mysterious place called life. And also, as I mentioned in the Four Truths, the the beginning practice is very much about embracing suffering. It's about opening one's mind and one's heart to the pain of the world. There's an 8th century Indian Buddhist monk, Shantideva, who actually asks at the end of the 6th chapter of his Bodhicharya Avatara, he says, if the Buddhas identify with the suffering of the world, how can they possibly be happy? How could they possibly experience joy? And I resonate very much with that. In some ways, if let's say, how can I put this? In many ways, happiness doesn't really seem to be the point. Happiness may be a bonus that we gain through living a full life, a rich life, but it may be that our commitment to simply living fully, embracing ourselves and the world, may not bring us what we might call happiness. It may bring us to a state of suffering, perhaps even, a sense of the tragedy of things, which for me are very much to do with the sense of living one's life at a greater depth. Happiness to me seems to float on the surface a bit. And even if this practice does not make me feel better in a sort of affective way, I would still pursue it. It's truth, I think, perhaps, that I'm more concerned with, or meaning, or value, or just a deeper penetration of the mystery of being alive. Whether that brings as its result happiness or not seems to be a secondary question for me. So that's my sense of that. But what's your sense, Owen, of the I mean, you mentioned some of this already, but do you feel that what would you explain as the reason why people are so drawn to this obsession with happiness? Is it part of our? Is it just another reflex of our Western hedonistic culture?
It's a good question. You've thought that. Yeah, I think there might be something to that. I mean, I don't know if Thomas Jefferson meant hedonism when he promised us, the right. I mean, notice it is in our blood and bones in the West, out of good important political. Aristotle says famously to us philosophers. Aristotle says, I go around asking people what they want that they don't want for anything else. There's some things we want, like money, we want for other things. Who would want to have money unless? And he said they all say in Greece, I want eudaimonia, EU from happy, daimon, spirit. I want to be a happy spirit. But he immediately notices that everybody means something different by eudaimonia. It is the end everyone seeks, but some people think it comes with political power, some think it comes from money. Some people think it comes from contemplation. He thinks it comes from an active life of reason and virtue, that's the way we humans work it out. There clearly, I think, happiness is just a good superordinate term for us, but it's like vehicle is to car, scooter, bicycle. I mean, it's just, and I do think, who would be against happiness, right? It does have, I think, sometimes hedonistic connotations for us. Happy, happy, joy, joy, click your heels. For other people, it means a kind of a serene state of mind that is more associated with the Buddhist states of mind that are promised. I also do think, and this maybe brings us back full circle before the question period, to some of the things you say. I think it appeals to Westerners as an end of life, not necessarily only for hedonistic reasons or for eudaimonistic reasons, but also because it points to something which truly is secular and not metaphysically bloated. And I think it comes surprising. There's a couple of young professors here from Columbia who came down and who I know from before, and a graduate student from NYU, and apparently they don't know too much about Buddhism because they said to me at the beginning, we were talking briefly, they said, well, I thought Buddhism doesn't have any of those kind of metaphysical beliefs. And it really does, for the most part. And as Stephen says, he became an agnostic Buddhist at some point, which meant you gave up maybe beliefs in wrathful deities and started to be neutral on rebirth and karma. Karma, Stephen nicely refers to as I think, a cosmic bookkeeping system. See, they'll be paid. You know, it doesn't look like justice always works in the actual world, and it's not surprising that we would like, that we have impulses to want it to work out, and karma does that. But I guess the question would be, you wondered earlier in our conversation about whether you shouldn't be something stronger than an agnostic Buddhist, and I think many of us on my team would say something like, there really is, it's polite to say to Buddhists, oh, it's possible that there's afterlife, or it's possible that your mind is not your brain. But really, smart people don't think that. There's no good arguments for that view, that you really shouldn't believe that if you're a well-educated and thoughtful person. All the other stuff you can believe, the Four Noble Truths as Stephen suggested it, but it really is a kind of acceptance of a kind of wish fulfillment for what a sensible person ought to believe. So this is the way, I think, one of the appeals of secular Buddhism that is happiness-focused is it doesn't look to be metaphysically puffed up.
That's true. That's true.
So,
yes, I mean, you see, to me, the other problem with the metaphysics, the past and future lives, the law of karma, different realms of existence, is that it is a device whereby we can somehow not be fully engaged with what is actually happening in this world here and now. I mean, if you really do believe in karma and rebirth, then you'd probably have to admit at some level that even if this world went up in a nuclear cloud, even if it became so polluted and life would die out on this planet, it wouldn't really matter, because all beings would then die and be reborn elsewhere according to their karmic acts, and thereby life would then continue elsewhere. And I feel that can serve as very much a way of denying the reality of this world, and also denying how utterly extraordinary it is that this world exists at all. And I think the Buddha was a radical at his time, because he rejected a worldview that posited any kind of ultimate reality, absolute reality. He seems to have, it's ambiguous as to whether he literally believed in rebirth or not, but when you look at the way he describes meditation, when you look at his account of awakening as an awakening to the Four Truths, it's all really only intelligible as a practice that brings us into a much closer, much more intimate, and also far more challenging encounter with what is happening here and now on this earth. And so one of the reasons I drop the agnostic thing and opt for what I now call atheist is that I feel the agnosticism still allows that wormhole out. It means that we do not have to commit ourselves with total and utter seriousness to the fact that this might be the only world that has ever been like this, and the only one that will ever exist in the future. This might be it. As far as we know, there is no other life in the universe. Statistically, it's likely, but we do not know that. And for me, Buddhism is radical. The Buddha was radical because he brought us into the moment, into our response to this world, into the suffering of this world. And that is what, for me, makes the practice of the Dharma so profoundly compelling.
Let me ask one final question before we go to discussion. So that was quite beautiful. Many people will say Buddhism is terrific in the compassion department, but weak in the justice department. And some things you say in your book makes me really excited about the possibility of, we didn't talk about this and it's only a little strand, so I'm not sure if this is fair, but one of the ways in which the Buddha was radical and iconoclastic is in his rejection of the caste system. You want to just say something about how you think that worked? I mean, where did that come from? Is just that his intuitions, or is it something about his overall view of the world and suffering?
Well, certainly the Buddha repeatedly critiques the social order of his time in ancient India. Unfortunately, though, it seems that that dimension of the Buddha's teaching never really was put into practice. And what is very striking, if you go to India today, you'll find that the caste system bedevils that culture much as it would have done at the Buddha's time. One gets glimpses in passages such as those, where the Buddha says that his Dhamma is like an ocean, and just as the 4 great rivers of India pour into the ocean and thereby lose their distinctiveness as the Ganges, the Yamuna, the Brahmaputra, in the same way, the different classes of people, the priests, the rulers, the workers, and so on, when they enter into his Dhamma, his teaching, his community, they lose their class identity. And this loss of class identity is, I think, an integral part of his teaching. Buddhism has become, in all traditions, very much a rather personal journey, which, again, as you say, does not give so much emphasis on justice and social justice and so on. But you do find these passages where not only does he advocate a letting go of that caste identity, but it also has very much to do with how he then understands the nature of the person. He says the person, or the person is who you are in the world is the result of your deeds. He says a farmer is a farmer because of what he does, a king is a king because of what he does, a merchant is a merchant because of what he does, not because of what he is. Now, in modern philosophy, this is sometimes called a performative conception of self. And part of the problem also in Buddhism is there's this common perception that Buddhism doesn't believe there is a self. And that, I think, is entirely wrong. The Buddha spoke quite explicitly about self as not as a fixed thing you're born with, but actually as a possibility you have in your life to create. And one of the obstacles to creating yourself was precisely the social system that defined you at birth as being like this or like that. So the social vision, the philosophical idea of personal transformation, the meditative practices are, for me, all integral parts of the same Dharma. And it's by going back to some of these early texts, I find, that we can begin to recover a picture of Buddhist practice that is not exclusively concerned with individual liberation and meditation, but gives equal weight to the need not only to transform oneself, but also to recognize that the world we live in is at some deep level often unjust, and that the suffering of others is just as important to respond to as the suffering of the individual person.
Great, thank you very much. Tim, we should go to discussion now, is that the idea?
Yeah, that certainly is a good idea, but there is also one question that I'd love to have addressed, and Owen, perhaps you're the one to do it, because you mentioned, why would the Buddha come across this idea of really negating the caste system? Was it intuition? Well, and the question posed by this particular program is, if the Buddha was a radical revolutionary, what is it about his mindset, his brain, if you will, that inherently allowed him to make that leap? Is there something? Have any studies been done on this?
There's a simple answer to that question. The brain is currently the most overrated organ. Nothing is known about it except where it lights up sometimes. When people are doing various things. The only, and certainly we know that being a radical, being iconoclastic, clearly these are things which require, they require a culture, require a history. The only interesting research, and has nothing to do with the brain, that I know of on radicalism were done by Frank Sulloway, who many people will know for a great biography on Freud, and this is about birth order. And I take it from what we know, Stephen will correct me, Buddha was probably the oldest son, but I don't know for sure. We don't know.
Well, he was the only son of his mother and Suddhodana. He had a half-brother. Right. That's as much as we know. Anyway,
the birth order findings in the West go like this, that older children are likely to be more conservative. They, after all, have to become the rabbi or the Jesuit or the scholar. And the younger sons, in particular, will tend to show up on your list of scientific revolutionaries, sometimes political revolutionaries. It's a very small effect, though, that has to do with birth order. I think nothing else is known about this. I mean, of course, there could be, just as Kay Redfield Jamison in her very important work on bipolar disorder and its association with creativity find that about 40% of the most famous dramatists and poets of the 19th century were also bipolar, which is statistically way out of line with the normal 1% to 4% base rate. So some what look to be psychological problems will release people from the needs to be a conformist. It looks to me, and Stephen makes this clear, that the historical Buddha, Siddhartha, was probably percolating up among many, many different groups of heterodox folk. But so there really is nothing known about the brain on this topic.
I'm so sorry to have brought you here on false pretenses.
But that's knowledge. Knowing is
We'll try this again next year. We can take we have about half an hour for questions. So we have microphones on either side of the house. So, and let's raise hands. The first up, okay, yes, sir. All right, third row, third in. And anybody on this side of the house would like to raise their hands and we get a microphone to them as well? No radicals amongst us here on this side? All right, well, let's get cracking. Okay.
Let me ask maybe a definitional question. Are you a dualist, or is the mind the brain, or is it somewhere in the natural world?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Either of you.
No, I find dualism somehow incoherent.
Could you explain what dualism is in case people don't know, Stephen?
Well, I suspect there are many different ways of doing dualism, but in Buddhism, a dualist position would be one in which the body and the mind are two irreducibly different substances. In other words, at physical death, the body, brain, the lot dies, but something, which is usually called consciousness, mind, or subtle, usually subtle mind. Subtle meaning, actually I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, we'll call it subtle. But it is definitely not something that can be, in any sense, material or physical. Now, most Buddhist schools that have developed after the Buddha are effectively dualistic in that sense, that they have to affirm the existence of a non-material, a knowing entity of some kind, very similar in a sense to Descartes' res cogitans, as opposed to the res extensa, the physical world. And that if there is not such an immaterial mind, then it's very difficult to explain how you get reborn. But there are enormous problems with that view. And the primary one that I see is that it's very difficult to understand how an immaterial something, a knowing, can have any kind of relationship, connection, or interaction with something that is material. I cannot comprehend how that could work. Now that could, of course, be the limitations of my own understanding. But that, for me, is the big stumbling block. What would you say about this?
No, I think this is exactly right. And this is something that people like myself who work in both philosophy and neuroscience would say. Stephen's exactly right that the traditional Buddhist view is dualistic. I've heard people, friends of yours and mine, Alan Wallace, say if you don't believe in mind-body dualism, you can't be a Buddhist. And it's very similar to Descartes' dualism. There are other kinds of dualism, but I would say this, that most contemporary philosophers and most contemporary mind scientists believe that there are no good arguments for dualism, that it's impossible to work out for reasons that Stephen suggested, and it's impossible to work out for as simple reasons as this. Today I decided to come here to keep my appointment. Well, the I who decided that, if you're a dualist, is an immaterial substance that somehow got 180 pounds of fighting manhood over here. And no one knows how to explain that. It violates the laws of physics.
But I think another point here is that the Buddha himself quite clearly said this. He said, I do not declare whether mind and body are the same or different. And to pursue such an inquiry, he said, is counter to what he does declare. And what he does declare is the Four Noble Truths. So in other words, I think the Buddha, if the Buddha were in the room today, and maybe he is somewhere, I don't know, he would probably say the whole issue is irrelevant. It actually detracts you. It's a big distraction from what is actually of importance, namely how we respond to the suffering of the world. It's irrelevant.
So we have a question, Diana. We have a question down here. And I think you raised your hand first, didn't you? Sorry, next to John Kuby. Did not? Okay, all right. So let's take a question here.
I understand, that happiness is kind of an insipid word, but you were talking about the basis, the Four Noble Truths, and letting go of suffering. Well, if you're going to let go of suffering, you can at least be a little pleased, aren't you?
Well, actually, I didn't say let go of suffering. I said let go of grasping. Okay. And what is striking, even if you look at the Buddha's own definition of dukkha nirodha, the cessation or the end of suffering, he says, what is this? He says it is the cessation of craving. He doesn't actually say it's the stopping of pain. And that's right in the first sermon. And in traditional Buddhism, the only meaningful way to stop suffering is to not get born again. As long as you are in a body, in a world, you're going to suffer. It's unavoidable. It's a given. Sabba sankhara dukkha, all conditioned things are dukkha. The only way to really be free from suffering is to attain a nirvana in which you are no longer born again. As long as you're in this world, there will be dukkha. Unavoidable. So what one lets... and to me, in my reading of the Four Truths, the problem with grasping or craving is not that it is the cause of suffering, which is your standard Buddhist dogma. But the problem with craving is that it inhibits you or prevents you or blocks you from entering the Eightfold Path, from actually letting go of your hesitations, your anxieties, your attachments, to begin to open up to the world in another way. That is what, for me, is the problem with craving, not the fact that it causes suffering. Of course, sometimes it does. There's no question of that. But to make the claim that craving is the cause of suffering is the kind of metaphysical belief one would have thought the Buddha would have put to one side. But yes, I think if you live this life, it is fulfilling. It enables your life to flourish. Martha Nussbaum, for example, speaks of eudaimonia, or however you pronounce it correctly, as human flourishing. And that, I feel, is much more important than the affect happiness.
Gentlemen in the second row, four in, if you don't mind. Thank you. Wait till the microphone gets to you, if you don't mind, sir. Thank you.
In your presentation or your interpretation of the Buddha, you said that he thought it critical to respond to the suffering of the world, and he was critical of the social structure of his time. And so just to bring that forward today, I want to ask, do you think that the Buddha would have been or was, I'm sorry, I'm not a Buddhist, I don't know anything about the history, but was he an activist? Did he think it important to change the world, or are we simply talking about responding in some way which is sympathetic but not activist? And so to bring it forward to today's world, what do you think the Buddha's response would be to ongoing problems that we have? For example, like if you say that capitalism is destroying the planet, which it is, I think, pretty obviously, what would the Buddha's response be to that? What should a Buddhist response be to that? Should we passively observe this, be sympathetic? Should we activists try to overthrow the social structure?
Well, it's difficult to speak on behalf of all Buddhists or the Buddha, but my hunch would be that it would, if one's analysis of suffering is that it has its roots in a particular form of behavior, and if one persists in that form of behavior, that suffering is only going to get worse, then clearly the responsibility would be to act and do something about it. Now, let me give you a good contemporary example. There are in India now millions of people who are converting to Buddhism. They're called the Dalits, the former untouchables. And they are becoming Buddhists, not because they want to meditate, not because they like the philosophy, not because they're trying to be happy in themselves. They're adopting Buddhism because it has become a social and political movement that is making a radical difference in the quality of their community's life. The political movement of the Dalits, these new Buddhists in India, is a very vital and dynamic political movement that is now gaining significant power at the moment at a state level, but potentially in the next 5 or 10 years could well become the governing party in India as a whole. And this has all been triggered by the work of a man called Bhimrao Ambedkar. And Ambedkar was the first Minister of Justice in Nehru's government in 1948. He was a former untouchable who converted to Buddhism, and this is, I think, a very good example of how Buddhism is, for Ambedkar, purely about social justice, to the point where he'll put aside personal well-being almost altogether, because he's addressing the need of millions of people who suffer from the indignity of the caste system. So that, I think, is instead of answering abstractly, I'd like to give you that as a concrete example of what is actually happening in the world now.
We have a question back here. Yes, quickly.
All right, so you were talking about at age 18, having left England a little bit, feeling disillusioned about how Western education worked. And, well, this December, I'm turning 18, and I find myself with similar questions, just realizing that in our education system, we're being taught to prepare, for the next step, and once we get to that step, prepare for the next step. And our whole lives are just sort of, up till now, preparing for something that I haven't experienced yet. I recently left my school and entered a new one, the School for Ethics and Global Leadership, in which the director of the school told me that his mission was to have teenagers have their midlife crises, in high school, to really, feel hypersensitive about what was being asked of us and contrast that with what we could actually accomplish. So my question is this. Several years have passed since, you left England at age 18. I'm just wondering after all these experiences, what has come of leaving England behind? What can be done to create a generation that isn't preparing for something, but is really living in the moment? I mean, not necessarily a Buddhist youth, but just one that is more aware, that is not caught in this, whirlpool of, of what, actually?
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, thank you very much for that. I mean, it's one of the things I feel I missed by not remaining in conventional European society was that I never had a family. My life has been one in which I've been very much out on a limb, really, living largely, from hand to mouth, without much money, pursuing my interests in Buddhist philosophy and so on. And for that and other reasons, I've not actually raised children. I don't have kids. And I think I've missed something in that. I feel rather disconnected now from the younger generation, and I think that is a problem for me. I hope that my life, as I've described it in this book, might give an example of someone who has abandoned the securities that our culture seems to be so attached to, and has taken the risk of doing something completely different. When I left home, my family were primarily concerned, when I became a Buddhist monk, for example, how are you going to survive in old age? How are you going to get a career out of this? They were very, very concerned about me. They thought I'd more or less thrown away my birthright, that I'd somehow cast myself out into the darkness of marginality. But one of the things that I feel most somehow gratified by is the fact that there was a small group of us in the late 60s, early 70s, who took that risk, who went out to India, who became monks and nuns, who did something that at the time, had no real sympathy whatsoever in the Western culture. If someone had told me in 1973, in 40 years' time there will be meditation centers all over the world, there will be museums in Lower Manhattan dedicated to Himalayan art, we would have written them off as fantasists. And yet it's because there was a sufficient number of us who made that leap of faith and did what we did, that we now have an emerging culture in the West, where Buddhism, both its ideas and its practices, are more and more accepted and integrated into the modern world, that we have this gathering here. So I think, for me, that's a very important confirmation of how, as a younger person, one does need to look deeply into oneself and ask, what really matters? What is it in my heart of hearts that I feel I should follow and do and act upon, even if, on the conventional scale of things, it looks as though it's just a fantasy or a youthful indulgence? To try to be as honest as one can with oneself and as courageous as one can, particularly if one does, as I feel, believe this is the only chance we're going to get this life. That's what I would encourage. Courage and a willingness to follow those intuitions in spite of all the resistance that you might meet in embracing them.
In other words, have a radical brain. Diana, if we could get the microphone in the first row, and then we'll take your question in the whatever row you were in. Can we get the mic over there? Thanks.
Thank you. Buddha nature, is that a Mahayana innovation that you've now thrown away, or have you found some intellectually rigorous, scientifically acceptable way of interpreting Buddha nature?
Well, that's a very good question, the question about Buddha nature. I could go on and on about this, but the Buddha himself does not use the term that we would translate as Buddha nature. The concept of Buddha nature developed in the later Mahayana schools. But when I was studying with Geshe Rabten, as a Tibetan Buddhist monk of the Gelug school, we studied a text called Rik Chiden, which means the general commentarial account of Buddha nature. And that text traced the idea of Buddha nature back to the Pali canon. It was there known as Aryagota, the lineage or the family of the noble ones. And that's the origin of the idea of Buddha Gotra, which, Buddha nature is a mistranslation for a start. It actually means Buddha family or Buddha lineage. And the Buddha recognizes that this thing called the lineage of the noble ones. And what are the characteristics of the person who, as it were, joins or finds himself or herself belonging to such a family? And there are 4 criteria: contentment with food, contentment with clothing, contentment with lodging, and a delight in cultivating the mind. Now, what's interesting about that is the Buddha seems to recognize that certain social conditions first need to be met before you can do this practice. It's not, Buddha nature in that sense is not just some inner spiritual potential we have, but it requires 3 out of 4 characteristics: the achievement of a certain kind of material well-being and comfort, an ability to be content with little perhaps, but to have enough. And that again is indicative of his social vision, that he would seem therefore to wish to create a society in which the basic provisions of life are provided. Again, it's a kind of quasi-socialist idea. Mm-hmm. But of course, as imagine very few of us are actually aware of the origins of Buddha nature in that rather, it might strike us as strange to think of it in that way. But I find that very insightful. Again, for reasons stated above, that he does recognize that one's spiritual life doesn't operate in a kind of vacuum, but it operates only when certain material conditions are met. And that has political and social implications.
I've read a couple of your books, and you mentioned earlier Sartre and some other existentialists.
Sorry, Sartre?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking, what Western philosophers have informed your thinking, and how have they informed your thinking?
Well, a number, if you read my book, I go through a lot of them. As Owen mentioned already, I was very, very influenced by the phenomenologists, Husserl, and then Heidegger, the early Heidegger particularly, not the Heidegger who becomes more mystical. Emmanuel Levinas, the Jewish phenomenologist, existentialist. But more recently, I've been very much taken by the work of Richard Rorty and thinkers within the American pragmatic tradition, going back to James and Dewey. Rorty in particular, I find has been very, very helpful in my thinking. I suspect you're aware of Richard Rorty's work. Probably one of the more important American thinkers of the past century. He recently died.
We have time for 2 more questions. We have one right at the back and one pretty much in the middle. So, Dinah, why don't we get this mic to lady in the middle, if we can. Just pass it along. Thank you.
You said that, if I can remember exactly, that we know nothing about the brain in terms of creating a radical, but we do know that the prefrontal cortex isn't completely developed until a certain age, which is the decision-making center. So I wonder if that might have something to do with leaving home at 18 to find meaning or to creating a radical.
It might. It's an interesting question. A lot of people were doing a lot of unusual things. Sometimes we just travel to the East Village. Some people travel to India. It was a zeitgeist thing. I'm not suggesting that, what Stephen just said about, I know a lot of, besides Stephen, I know a lot of his friends who did this, and I know from all of them that they would have never predicted that they would have ended up becoming monks or nuns. Or that there would be this flourishing of Western Buddhism. My skeptical remarks about the brain, it just has to do with the fact that the causal features of the world are very, very, very powerful. And we live in an age of, the first President Bush, of course, you may know this, called the 1990s the decade of the brain. And we've only been staining brain cells for a little over a century. We know very, very little. We're just starting to map it. Imagine a time in the world in which we didn't even know how to draw. You've all seen maps like this where we didn't know what the extent of the Americas or the right shapes were. We're still at that stage of just doing mapping right now. There are obviously phenotypic differences in brains, and every single person in this room has a very, very different brain from everyone else in this room. My only point was just there's nothing is known to explain. We don't even know for the mental illnesses that afflict 1% of the population, like schizophrenia, what's going on in their brains. And there's a lot of attention to that. So believe me, we don't know anything about what makes a Stephen Batchelor, a Buddha, or Mahatma Gandhi, or an Owen Flanagan for that matter. Thank you.
Well, we'll be exploring the issue of whether we're wired in some way to respond spiritually to things. Are we wired for worship, for example? In fact, a person who asked the question about dualism, John Kuby, is going to be sitting down with the anthropologist Lionel Tiger to address that very question. So his question was kind of a loaded one. I think he's doing his research in this program, but good for you, John. So we have a final question right at the back. Yes, you've got the microphone, have you? Great, thank you.
Getting back to the happiness thing, I think people are unhappy. And I know in the Christian tradition there's something called acedia, which is basically, it was first noted in the 3rd century AD, which is basically spiritual boredom, which is a precursor to depression. And I think we know a little more about the brain than we think. We know that it's a bundle of chemistry. And then when people feel good or bad, there's chemical footprints associated with that. So my question is this. Taking what you've said and looking ahead, didn't the ancients that we're talking about, specifically Buddha, understand how to manage his brain chemistry in a way that was good for him and good for the world? And isn't that the whole point of what religion and spiritual practices are supposed to be doing? And how are we going to make that happen?
So that's several simple questions. I don't know if we're really, yeah, good. So it's a good point. I mean, maybe we are really unhappy. What I do know is that people complain a lot. It's an interesting question whether or not this is an age or a time, and we'd always have to locate it here. Like we might want to say, are New Yorkers unhappy, or they just complain a lot? It's an interesting question. I mean, there's a wonderful book by Roger Paul Droit called Buddhism and Nihilism, and it was actually a book about the reception of Buddhism in 19th century Europe by philosophers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and how much they loved Buddhism because they thought it was so depressing. And that kind of fit their mood. I mean, it really was thought to be, I'm being quite serious, it was thought to be just an affirmation of the meaninglessness of everything. And this was a tradition that really resonated with this particular school of late 19th century philosophy. Now so can people be comfortable in their own skins and be depressed? We know that the same thinkers 50 years later that influenced Stephen, the existentialist, talked constantly about an anomie, a kind of a boredom, and you talked about ancient Christian. These are certainly common human feeling states. There's no question about that. And again, they're often brought on by horror of socio-political events, like in the case of the existentialists in France and Germany after the Second War. But to your question about, wasn't Buddha doing something, as it were, before Prozac? And no, you're certainly right that this is going to be, when I talk about that all we know is how brains light up, we know that the most interesting thing about brains is not where there's neuron firings, but where there's neurochemicals. And we know, for example, when Peter Kramer wrote his wonderful book about listening to Prozac, this was the first ability to intervene with human suffering of a sort that does seem to be quite common. And back to the gentleman's question about, but antidepressants don't make you happy. They just make you maybe not suffer, so you can then figure out ways to make yourself happy. And so I think your point is very good. Clearly, if you're a materialist about the mind and not a mind-body dualist, if anyone is able to engage in self-work, or by exercise, or by whatever means they do to make themselves, or by medication to make themselves feel a little better, and that would include living a good ethical life, I take it, then you're doing something to your embodied self. I think that's certainly right. We just don't know the details of that story. But that looks like it's got to be the right kind of story. I think it's an interesting question. How would one know, this is the epistemologist in me, how would one know that a certain age is, as it were, more depressed, in ennui, in boredom than another age? I don't know that. Sometimes people will write about those sorts of things, and then we'll say, well, that age must have been this way. I don't know how we know that. But I've always been the cup is half full rather than half empty kind of person, so it's my chemistry.
That's why we love having you here. I would actually like to make a suggestion. Those visitor information cards. Whether or not you want to come on Saturday, regardless, why don't you just mark down in the comments side what you'd like to have addressed in Brainwave 2011. And that will help me steer the way we configure the next series, because I think it might be quite instructive to know what your responses are. Stephen, you mentioned, the whole issue of, is there life out there, and are we a unique life form, and the possibility of whether there's engagement and some form of organic entity out in space. And of course, this is one of the things we're engaged in this current Brainwave, because we're reflecting ideas voiced in the Visions of the Cosmos exhibition. So Claire Evans, who is a rock musician who's fascinated by this question, is going to sit down with Fred Adams, who wrote, the 5 Ages of the Universe, and they're going to try and work out what the possibilities are, the permutations of whether there's life out there. I think it's on March the 21st. But I also wanted to just cast forward a little bit about the issue of rebirth, and even thinking about that possibility. How on earth is it actually helpful to us or relevant to us in our culture, living here in this particular world that we know? And you might have, who's managed to get to the exhibition on Bardo, the Tibetan Art of the Afterlife, on the 5th floor? Anybody yet? Well, go after you've bought a book. Once you've bought a book, head upstairs to the galleries and check it out. And I'll tell you why, because in July and August, Ramon Prats, who curated the exhibition, he's known as one of the best translators of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Unfortunately for me, it's in Spanish, so I can't really benefit from it. But we do have him here as a curator, and he's going to do 7 sessions. And the 7 sessions are going to be called the Tibetan Book of the Dead Book Club. And we're going to read passages from the Tibetan Book of the Dead and analyze them with a different type of practitioner, a neuroscientist, an Egyptologist, an analyst, to try and figure out, okay, what can we actually draw from this tome that makes sense for us in our culture? And I suggest you all buy into that, because it's going to be a fascinating session if you're going to be here in the summer. So do take part in that. Well, we have to wrap up, because, of course, we've got another Brainwave program at 4:30. But I'm not quite sure whether I should venture to do this. I usually do this, but I'm not sure whether atheists accept Katak scarves. But I'm going to try it anyway, because it is, after all, in the Tibetan culture, a sign of us honoring a visitor, and Stephen and Owen, I hope you'll accept them from us. But before I do that, I just want to give you, given that I know a little bit about how the brain works, and part of it is by visual recognition, Owen Flanagan, The Really Hard Problem, on sale upstairs at the shop. Confession of a Buddhist Atheist by Stephen Batchelor, on sale at the shop. And I know it seems to run counter to our philosophies that we'd encourage the acquisition of material possessions like books and things. But you know what? Times are hard. Thank you for coming out. Diana will collect your cards with lots of interesting comments on them as you leave, and we'll see you all up at the shop, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for bringing